Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. Major update on what we can expect from the 2026 cars, especially what Mercedes have been up to over the last few months, not just on the engine, but on the aero side as well. Reports suggest they've set very aggressive targets and have matched or exceeded absolutely everything when it comes to the new season. Scary for the rivals or a 2022 repeat. There was lots of optimism from Mercedes around what they did at the start of 2022, and the next 4 years were in many respects an absolute disaster. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Plenty to get into today. We're going to begin here with former Formula 1 driver Jack Doohan. He's making the transition to Super Formula next season. Challenging a couple of days for him, doing a couple of tests in Super Formula. He crashes once yesterday, then he crashed again today at the same corner. Now I was trying to figure out which corner it was because I thought it doesn't really look like turn 1, but let's not forget when he tried to take turn 1 with the DRS open, and that didn't end especially well at Suzuka this year. This is once again at Suzuka, but this was actually the first of the two Degner corners around Suzuka, so here he comes into the first of the couple of Degners. He takes in a bit too much speed, takes a bit of inside curb, unstabilizes the car, and then he's on the rear curb into the gravel, and shortly afterwards he is into the wall and the camera dies. So not a great couple of days. Also thought this was interesting, maybe surprising, maybe unfortunate. I'm sure that Jack Doohan, maybe as a result, has been, well, getting some DMs on Instagram. We saw that Kimi Antonelli decided to take his profile private after what happened back in Qatar. Doohan has, well, not take it private, but black out his profile picture, whatever. Doohan's now done the same thing. So, yeah, he's been going through it the last few months. Certainly, the Doohan Colapinto was not ideal, maybe for his social media mentions either. The other 2026 development, before we talk about the cars, is on this. So, these cars next year are very complicated. They may be fantastic, although I doubt it. They may have plenty of problems. I think that's very likely. We are going to be talking about a lot of technical directives, I am sure, over the next 12 months. Probably longer than that, to be honest. But there are several new features on the cars. DRS is gone, at least in part. I mean, it's gone in terms of the car behind opening it for a drag reduction system advantage. But there is active aerodynamics. They changed the angles of the front and the rear wings. We've seen that tested out at Abu Dhabi over the last couple of days. But the FIA have decided that the terminology they've been using to describe all this stuff is just too complicated for the fans, because we've got active aero, so we've got the different modes of activation. We've then got, of course, DRS is gone, but there is a boost mode on the electronic deployment, and then there is an additional, like, extra boost mode that you can use on occasion to go for an overtake. So it's all rather complicated. All these things do have names, but they're set to rename basically all of them. So you guys may remember that initially they described, I don't even know which one it was, but effectively straight line mode was called X mode on the active aero, and cornering mode was called Y mode. It might have been the other way around. At this point, who really cares? Because it's not clear which one of those is which, really. So then they switched and they said, okay, we're not going to call it X and Y because it makes no sense. It's a very engineer thing to do. But when you look at it from the fan perspective, then people are like, what are you talking about? Then they've switched it to straight line mode and cornering modes, but now they're not going to talk about it at all. Their logic there, which I think is probably good logic, is to say that, well, all the cars are the same on this front, right? They're all going to have low downforce modes on the straight and high downforce mode on the corners. Obviously, the low and the high downforce will vary on the car and on the setup they've chosen, but effectively every team will be doing that. I think it will also be GPS relevant as well. I mean, yeah, so they'll only be able to change at certain GPS points. That's how it's going to be. It's the same for all cars. You might ask, understandably, why, right? Why would we do this? Because there's no overtaking advantage. It's just all the cars are driving around and they're going to move up their wings all the time. The reason is because of this massive battery, basically. Because if they go down a straight with cornering mode on, or Y mode, whatever, they will run out of charge. So the whole point of this active aero, and the reason why it will, of course, be talked about, but they don't really want to make it that much of a big deal, and now they're not going to talk about it at all in terms of straight line speed and cornering mode, is because all the teams are going to do it effectively as a countermeasure for this massive hybrid component of the engine, which is very, very thirsty indeed, and recharging under braking and getting charged up by the ICE is simply not enough to feed the beast that is the massive battery that we now have. So that's why they need these aero modes, so they don't use up so much battery in a straight line effectively. But there are other things that they're also working on. So currently we have ERS deployment, right? So the energy is recovered. You can then deploy that energy. The way that that's deployed around the lap time depends on what the driver does on his steering wheel, as in the overtake button, which dumps that additional battery. The teams also back at the garage from the pit wall can decide during a lap where the energy is being deployed. The teams that do that best, such as Honda, their power seems to be very good. Okay, I said teams, but the manufacturers in Honda that do that the best, they seem to have had the best ERS over the last few years. They seem to gain a bit more, can use a little bit more, helping Verstappen's straight line speed when that Red Bull was a monster, as we know, a couple of years ago in a straight line. So there's all these factors. But next year it's going to change, because you can still, of course, deploy energy. In fact, you'll be deploying energy pretty much all the time, right? Because you've got this massive battery in the back. But there will be modes where you can effectively override what you can normally deploy and deploy more to go for an overtake. Now, this is effectively the DRS replacement. This is the push-to-pass system, as we call it in IndyCar. Obviously, it's a bit different because here in F1, we still have boosts, right? And boost is the electrical deployment. But then there's the manual override mode, which lets you do super boost, as it were. That's really the overtaking mode. So that used to be called manual override mode, acronym MOM, which, is just never going to work, right? For so many reasons. That was always going to have to change. So they're now just going to call that overtake mode, which is okay, right? Kind of similar to how we currently describe the DRS or the ERS buttons, alright? God, all this terminology does get to your head a little bit. Anyway, those are the changes. Active Aero is just going to be called Active Aero. We're no longer talking about straight line mode, quartering mode, because all the teams are going to do it anyway, so who cares? Probably fair enough. Then we've got the overtake mode, as it's now called, in addition to the ERS boost. So, hope you wrapped your head around all that. I'm sure that we'll get used to it as time goes on. The other thing for 2026 is, what about McLaren? It's a good question. We've talked a lot about Mercedes, and we'll continue to, I'm sure, over the coming weeks. They have a Mercedes power unit, obviously, in a Mercedes chassis. Next season, you would expect that to give some advantage to Mercedes because it's brand new set of regulations. There's been no time for that integration of the chassis and the electrical engine, let's say, to be moved in a positive direction for a team like McLaren because they buy the engine, right? So in theory, Mercedes should be best suited to the new generation if the Mercedes engine turns out to be the best. But McLaren also have an incredible team of engineers. They've dominated this year's championship, so why would they not also be back in the conversation? They absolutely should be for next year. It would be a bit of a shock if they're not, especially if the Mercedes engine is actually very good. Now, the question therefore will be, okay, Piastri and Norris, in my opinion, it won't last forever. I don't think it will really last that much longer as a duo. But they will be there next season. They may be competing for the title again with the man who appears to be stood behind them here in George Russell. Now, Piastri, of course, is not expecting any different treatments, right? He says, like, okay, Lando's won it, but not like he's turned into Superman. I'm still expecting to be treated fairly. Obviously, we'll see how that plays out next season. There's also some remarkable comments coming out of Helmut Marko. Not really remarkable, I just find it interesting that now Marko has been forced into retirement, shall we say, by Red Bull. He may return in some capacity, but it's not going to be under Red Bull Racing. He may be even more unhinged. Don't know what you guys think, right? But Marko is no longer giving interviews on behalf of Red Bull, but he will certainly still be talking to the press because the press love talking to Marko and he loves talking to the press. So we're still going to get Marko comments, which I'm pretty happy about. These are a few things he had to say. Even if you're in a fast car, if you don't have good technique, you can't win. Of course, translated from the Austrian and then from the Turkish here. So, it's obviously gone through a couple of translations. 2 points to 2 points. 10 years from now, no one will remember them. They'll remember Lando was the world champion. He goes on to say this, he was way behind Oscar, but he recovered, and by delivering spectacular races in the second half of the year, he overshadowed Piastri. He proved all the predictions wrong that said he didn't have the mentality to overcome that. He is a very strong driver on a world-class level. I think he specifically made reference to qualifying. There was actually a couple of replies here that said, yeah, even in a fast car, you can't win without having technique. I think we've seen that quote. He drove brilliant races. Yeah, world-class driver, very strong in qualifying, he said. And also, this I thought was interesting. He went on to say, I believe, unfortunately, I guess as a Red Bull guy, if he gets the right car, this result could very much be repeated in the future, which is, interesting. Like, it's difficult to predict, not knowing how good that McLaren is going to be for the next couple of years, what Lando's chances are of either going back to back or winning another title over the next few years. But I think that's why it's worth waiting a few years before we properly look at and judge the context of this particular championship. Of course, we can judge it now based on how we see it now, for sure. But in a few years, it's going to become clearer how impressive or not impressive this championship and Lando Norris actually is as a driver. But it will all depend on 2026 in large part. If the teams start out strong, of course, having said that, McLaren started woefully in 2022 and ended up dominating the year with both championships on the final season. So things can turn around, but 2026 is critical. Certainly for Ferrari, we know that to be true. They even kind of said it themselves, the most important Ferrari in a long time. This is the wheel, right? We've seen the upgrades to the wheel, updates, let's say, changes to the wheel. We don't really know if they're improvements or not necessarily. But this is the new Ferrari wheel. Hamilton has been quite insistent on moving some things around, removing some of the things from the wheel. And you can absolutely see the similarities there, can't you now, with what Mercedes have. Actually, a lot of similarities indeed, even with some of the button placements. Not exactly the same, and it's not totally radically different to what they previously had, but it's worth noting that Hamilton's influence on this is very much evident. Now, if the car isn't good though, it ain't going to matter. Charles Leclerc might go. We talked yesterday, there are 3 teams interested. The article didn't describe which 3, but we can guess Aston Martin for sure. The other 2, well, of course, if Haas, I don't know, if Leclerc says, I really want to drive for AlphaTauri, then they're going to be like, yeah, sure, why not, right? Or, I don't know, Haas or something. But I guess maybe Audi, Cadillac, of course, those other teams, of course, they're going to be interested. The question is, which of the serious teams are going to be interested? Aston is one, Mercedes quite possibly another. Who else could it be? Good question. Maybe Red Bull, depending on what the situation looks like over there. Leclerc will decide whether he stays or whether he goes a few races into the season. Hamilton may not get to decide. There was some talk today that Hamilton's deal does run through, we think it is a 3-year deal, at least in some parts. We believe it was more like a 2+1, right? So there were some rumours it was a straight up 3-year deal. There were other rumours it was a 2+1. It now appears that it's a 2+1, but where do the options lie? Because with Hamilton's final contract with Mercedes, the option was both ways. They could decide to get rid of him. He could decide to leave of his own accord. That's what he decided to do going into this most recent season. But in 2027, he may not have the option to extend. Apparently, that lies with Ferrari. So they will see. But the point is, I guess, if Leclerc next year, the car isn't good, and Leclerc decides, you know what, I can't waste my prime with Ferrari. I've got to go somewhere else. I've got to go to Aston or something like that and give it a go with a newie machine going forwards. That could happen. If that does happen, would Ferrari want to get rid of both drivers at the same time? That feels pretty unlikely to me. So, I wouldn't be surprised if Hamilton's still there in 2027 at all, despite obviously a challenging season that he had. But it also depends whether he actually wants to do it or not, which is another question. Because, again, if Charles Leclerc leaves the team, is that going to give Hamilton the confidence to stay around? Not necessarily. But speaking of 2026, where are we in terms of car performance? Where are we in terms of engine performance? Those are the key metrics right now. The Audi project, they've said they're behind the curve. They're not going to be winning titles anytime soon, so we can put that to one side. The question is, are Mercedes really going to be the best, given all their talk that they're going to be the best? Not even they've said this, but it seems that everyone is saying in the paddock, the only engine that's being talked about is the Mercedes engine. So that gives 4 teams, Mercedes, McLaren, Williams, and of course Alpine coming on board this year as well. Is it Honda who are going to be closer than anyone else? Right now, we don't really know. But in many respects, what's more interesting here is what's going on with the chassis, right? What's happening on the aero side? Because, yeah, their engine might be spectacular, but what if Williams, with loads of intention for 2026, load of technical development time as well, more so than the other teams? What if they nail it, right? Could we see Williams back to the top? I don't think they'll be far away. I think there's a good chance Williams top, fifth in the constructors this year. I think they could certainly move up next year. It's not impossible at all. Maybe they could be 4th. you know, you want to think maybe Ferrari or Red Bull can get stuck in with Mercedes and McLaren, but you'd expect Mercedes and McLaren for sure to be right up there as well. But is their car going to be any good? Because in 2022, they came up with a number of ideas, the Zero Pod especially, and through that entire era, they failed, really. And even this year's car, it was better, it was more stable, but then they turn up to Abu Dhabi and they're kind of nowhere again, aren't they, right? We've seen it a lot of times with this Mercedes over the last few years. So their performance has continued to fluctuate. Their tools, their, let's say, ability to simulate what would actually happen when they put the car together in their minds or in their simulators, in their CFD, to what happens out on track was a really big deal and a massive problem. Now, ground effect is gone to a degree. The Venturi tunnels are gone. The floor is flatter. It's not got the tunnels anymore. There will still be some level of ground effect, but it won't be to the same extent. So it should suit Mercedes, but Mercedes, are they hitting their goals? They're setting goals, but are they hitting them? This article suggests yes. Not only have they set very ambitious goals, but they have exceeded them and solved all of the problems associated with it. I'll hit the translation here on the article from the Italian. It says the following: Wolves is not particularly optimistic, but according to information gathered, Mercedes has invested more than any other team in the new regulations. Now, I guess if you include chassis and engine, that might be true. Of course, Mercedes don't have more testing time than others. You know, it felt like there were other teams that probably switched off a little bit earlier. Like McLaren also switched off 25 quite early. Williams seemed to switch off very early indeed. But what is clear is that maybe at least of the front runners, Mercedes have committed a lot to 2026. The goal is clear: to begin a second winning streak with the regulations that will come into force. The team is on the right track because all the challenges the team faced in building the new car have been brilliantly overcome, which is quite the statement, right? They've set very high goals. They've been extremely ambitious in their aero development and their chassis and everything that comes into play with that suspension, etc., and all of the problems. And this article suggests they've nailed everything, but it's obviously never that simple, right? Because what happens when it hits the track? They were telling us that that Zero Pod was going to be a second a lap faster. Maybe they weren't saying it. People were saying it. The Zero Pod was going to be a second a lap faster than their other concept. That's what Mercedes thought. Was it any faster at all? No. Did it porpoise? Yes. So let's see what happens when we actually get to the track. It is interesting what Toto says about cost cap, because it's now no longer possible to just pay your way to the championship in a way. Obviously, there is, look, you can spend more money, but engineers have to still make the car faster, right? But the point is that under the cost cap, it is more of a challenge. As he says, like, we would have been in an arms race again. Maybe it wouldn't have been McLaren fighting there with us on top if that had have been the case. But yeah, and tweet your thoughts in the comments. The only final thing here to mention is actually on those engines, because Mercedes therefore have a lot of engines because they need to supply all of their cars that they're supplying with 2 engines. So, you know, 16 engines to Australia they've got to take because they've got 8 cars. They've got 16 engines they've got to deploy for those 8 cars across that period, because, you know, they tend to use practice engine, race engine, stuff like this. So that means, as far as Thomas Howell says from Mercedes High Performance Powertrains, they have to stop their development slightly earlier because they need to make sure that they have enough time to create all those engines, whereas Honda need maybe 4 or 5 for their 2 cars with Aston Martin. So they have a better environment there, but also because they have 4 times as many engineers looking at the data, then it could be better, right? So it's kind of better and worse. But this I thought was interesting that Toto says that the intention from Mercedes is to cut the number of teams that it supplies in the future. They don't really want to supply 4 teams, and they will intend to cut that to 3. So which one will they cut? Will be interesting, right? Alpine have only come on board this year. They could get rid of them. Williams might have to look for a new partner. Who knows? As I say, Honda, you know, they're back, right? But now they're only supplying 1 team. They were supplying 2 with Racing Bulls. I can see Honda partnering up, if they're any good, with some of these other teams. You know, McLaren Honda, could it be back? Would Mercedes tell McLaren, yeah, our engine's the best, you guys are a bit too good, jog on, right? Like, I don't think so. Something to keep in mind. But very much into your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.